All right. Good evening, everyone tuning in to both Just Weather and News 6 WKMG. I'm News 6 meteorologist David Nazario, joined with News 6 meteorologist Jonathan Kagas tonight for your Monday evening Tropics Watch. Jonathan, I think you might be muted on your end. I'm seeing comments in the chat, that's why. Yeah, absolutely. Let me go ahead and jump on over. We'll go ahead and switch to just the main camera while Jonathan troubleshoots. So first and foremost, welcome back from what was a very busy week last week with Hurricane Milton. I feel like Milton and Helene had us working overtime here in Central Florida, whether it be at News 6 or just in general clocking in for all the weather forecasting and observations we had to do during that point in time. We are still seeing a bit of residual impacts from Milton, which has been a struggle for a lot of us. It's been very sporadic out there across Central and North Florida. South Florida got whacked hard by the supercell tornado outbreak before Milton actually made landfall. And then we had to deal with overnight major hurricane impacts along the West Coast. And then all the way through Central Florida as that system underwent the transition from tropical to non-tropical. Milton actually took upon that transformation fairly quickly as well. I do recall that the very following morning, the following afternoon, when I was actually transitioning from digital to broadcast, National Hurricane Center had already pulled the plug on Milton and decided, let's go post-tropical cyclone. That's how quickly it had evolved over our viewing area, likely why we saw such a weird landfall signature on radar and satellite, all the different various impacts we saw throughout the Florida peninsula, ranging from the tornado outbreak all the way to the overnight impacts when the center of Milton crawled through the Four Corners area. And then even after that, with that sting jet, that sinking momentum transfer wind event that occurred on the backside of Milton as well. We're going to talk a little bit about that and also begin to discuss a little bit of what's on the horizon. Nothing, too crazy out there in the tropics, thankfully. I personally think Mother Nature has given us a bit of a break. We're closely watching 94L for our friends and our viewers down there in the Lesser Antilles and the Greater Antilles, likely not going to pose a threat to any of us in the United States. Now, we have that blip that National Hurricane Center just recently highlighted. We don't know why, for an 0 for 20 chance of development over the next 7 days. And we're going to talk about that as well and kind of debunk that and more or less demystify why it is National Hurricane Center may have highlighted it. Jonathan, can you hear me? You ready to come back? Let's see. Let's bring Jonathan back up. Looks like we still can't hear you for some reason. Let me see if there's something on my end. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Go ahead and give it a shot, Jonathan. And now it looks like Jonathan is frozen. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and rock and roll. I don't know what's going on. We lost him. Man down. Medic. All right. So anyways, this is where, let me go ahead and switch this over real fast. And I'm going to bring up everything that I have in front of me. Oh, there's Jonathan. Jonathan, go ahead and give it a whirl now. I changed a couple settings on my end.
Sounds good, man. I think that's what was, now I'm on the wrong microphone again because it didn't work.
No, I can hear you on my end. I think we're working. I think we're back.
Oh, okay. We're so back. All right, let's get ready to rock and roll. Apologies, guys. I think the system is taxed out from all the hurricane coverage over the past couple of days.
All right, let me go ahead and get you links for here in just a second.
Perfect.
And then you can go ahead and steer, my friend. Here we go. We're merging in 3, 2. There it is.
Excellent. And David, could you hit that little record button on your computer as well? Want to splice this up? It's down in that corner next to the stream
Yep,
button.
got it.
You the man. All right. So started off by saying we're thinking about everybody that was impacted, not only by Helene, of course, but Milton, the most recent one. And I wanted to give a shout out to all of the linemen. It was a beautiful sight driving around Central Florida this weekend and just seeing all of the linemen out. And I mean, I know there are still people without power, but seriously, they have done a phenomenal job getting this many people back given the intense damage from the big time tornadoes that David was talking about down in South Florida. And then, of course, the landfall site in Pinellas and into Hillsborough County. There are still a decent amount of people without power, especially in the hardest hit areas. But man, look at these. I mean, these were in the hundreds of thousands. Orange County, Volusia County alone had over 100,000 people without power. So that is something to be said for them. Best people around working over the weekend and working around the clock to help get us our power back. So thank you guys. Okay, so David was talking about this right off the bat. Here are the two areas, and he's really going to get into it in a couple of minutes when we're talking about it. This is 94L that's just chilling out here. That little itty bitty guy right there. That's it. 94L. That's really all I have for you on that. It's shrouded by some drier air. It's pretty wild with how much dry air is around it now. So development chances are going to be slim to none, maybe until it gets to about the Virgin Islands in that vicinity. It can escape that, but I mean, it's going to have to survive that drier air. This one looks a little more impressive. These thunderstorms down here. The thing of it is that there's not a lot of time for it to develop. The land is right there. So we're likely looking at a tropical rainstorm for Central America. And we'll get into that a little bit more coming up. David's going to talk a little bit more about the long range stuff coming up in a couple of minutes to kind of see, okay, is the season over now? Or do we still have some extra stuff to go? But before we get into that, I want to really talk about where we've been, where we stand relative to normal, and where we stand relative to the preseason forecast that were kind of off the chain a little bit. So, of course, we just got through with Category 5 Hurricane Milton making landfall in Florida as a Category 3 system. Contrary to TikTok, we do not have Nadine just yet. We may end up getting it, but certainly not the track that was plastered all over social media last week that it was going to take the same track as Helene because somebody jacked Helene's track and then put Nadine on it. Photoshop. It's a crazy tool these days, but we've now made it through the M storm. So this is where we stand in terms of the forecast. So David Noah predicted earlier in the season their highest ever. I'm using Colorado State's initial one as well here, not the one that they updated. So this was the initial forecast from both NOAA, CSU, 17 to 25 name storms for NOAA. CSU had 23 name storms. To date, we're at 13. Here's what I'm going to say that, okay, these crazy forecasts are actually right on the money. A lot of those extra storms are to account for some of these ugly looking, not very organized subtropical storms that just kind of flare up and fizzle out. I always say prior to the season, look at kind of where I want to focus your attention on, okay, how many hurricanes are they expecting? How many majors are they expecting? Well, we're right on the money, right in the range in NOAA, catching up to 11, and then certainly right there for the major storms. So while we're likely not going to catch the range there in terms of the intensity, I think they hit the nail on the head, David.
No, I completely agree. And you and I were talking earlier about we should primarily focus on the number of hurricanes and the actual major hurricanes. And unfortunately for this hurricane season in particular, the named storms may not quite be there. So I'm sure we're going to have one or two persons out there who will still say, well, we forecasted 23 and got, we'll say hypothetically 15. Season's a bust. But we have compounded on the impacts, whether it be in billions of dollars, whether it be in animals' lives displaced, and let alone the fatalities involved in every single one of these storms. So that in of itself, the fact that we've probably beaten out a number of our more active hurricane seasons just based on these numbers goes to show that even though we're not naming every single sloppy system out there, like you said, regardless, we could very easily, if we really wanted to, and I shouldn't say we, but if National Hurricane Center really wanted to, and we definitely talked about this earlier today as well, we could probably be somewhere between 17 to 20 named storms if we wanted to, because there were a lot of low-level, mid-level spins out there with that general thunderstorms that had the quote look, that shrimpy appearance on satellite, but National Hurricane Center wasn't biting, which would honestly be a great conversation to have after the fact to see where their thought process was, considering last year they named some pretty gnarly looking systems on satellite. But that's neither here nor there. Regardless, we've had a very impactful season, and that's what this season is going to be remembered as once we finally close everything up at the end of November.
And David, we had talked early on whenever we kind of first met at the conference that the Division of Emergency Management had with the Florida broadcast journalists back in the day. I mean, that was in April. We talked at length about how we thought that the impacts were going to be there, how no matter how many named storms would form, that land would be threatened exponentially greater than what we had last year. I mean, last year is going to win out in terms of named storms, but we had a lot of those fish storms that curved and hit nothing. This year, we've had Beryl make landfall, Francine make landfall, Debbie make landfall, Helene make landfall, in Milton. Is that 5? Is that 5 hurricanes?
Yeah, 5 hurricanes. We've had pretty much every single storm make landfall minus Gordon. Gordon, you could argue, was the only true definitive fish storm because it formed out there off of Africa and then just dawdled around until it died. Even Ernesto impacted lots of people in the Caribbean, hit Bermuda, and then came with a close shave to Atlantic Canada.
Mm-hmm. And even Kirk, obviously, it curved as expected. But, that thing, I think in our opinions, the satellite data was suggesting it made it to Cat 5 status. Again, didn't hit anything. And I mean, certainly that's one of the meter-looking storms you will see. That's the one that we particularly like because we can admire the kind of beauty and awe of these storms, knowing that it's not going to hit anybody. But boy, intensity is something that's going to be the calling card of this season. And speaking of which, just for some perspective here, so we're on 9 hurricanes, as we just showed you. The basin average is 7. Okay, so we're ahead of that. We've already beat it by 2. There may be another one in the works, and David's going to talk much more about that coming up in a couple of minutes. We're at 13 named storms. We hit that on the 5th of October. Typically, we don't see that 13th named storm until the 25th of October. We average 14 in the Atlantic Basin. And then this is the big one here. You got to look at the named storms and then the ACE. Either so or either way, it doesn't tell the story of impacts because you can have a ginormous ACE number, which ACE again is that accumulated cyclone energy that once it becomes a tropical storm, it starts to generate ACE and it gets higher for the stronger the storm is and the longer that it's out there. So Kirk was a huge ACE generating storm, and Milton was too. I mean, it wasn't out there too long, but it got intense. But we're at 140.65 as of October 14th. The average is 91.57, which is good for 10th most intense season on record, David.
Absolutely correct, Jonathan. We have a very interesting question that folks are actually mentioning in the chat right now. Melissa Riley, I'm sorry if I keep repeating this, but is it true when it's cool out, the hurricane will not hit Florida? So believe it or not, that is actually 100% correct in its very simplest of ways. And essentially, when it's cool out here in Florida, which is what we're going to be experiencing here over the next couple days, we have a pretty dominant fall frontal system that's going to come south. What that does is, along the leading edge of that cool air mass or the high pressure that sinks down as a result of that cooler air, you have your front. And the front, as you've all heard before, whether it be Jonathan or myself or other weather sources out there, we call that the force field. So whenever it is cool, high pressure, as we used to say in the Air Force, clear blue 42, big bubble, no trouble, as the name implies, it's going to act like a barrier. And all the systems that are going to try to come our way are going to end up bouncing right off that barrier and ricocheting back into the Atlantic. That's kind of what some of our models are thinking with 94L. It tries to organize, tries to make a run through the Turks and Caicos, get into the Bahamas, and then it it stalls out. Some people are a little dumbfounded by this. It's actually pretty textbook. It tries to make a run for the west, bounces right off that force field, and just gets slingshot back out into the Atlantic because we have a fairly strong high pressure that's going to be coming down and situating itself over the East Coast, the Appalachians, and so on, which is why we're going to be sitting pretty comfortably out here in Florida for the rest of the week come tomorrow night and through, Wednesday.
And I'll pull that up here. I had the spaghetti models for you. They kind of take it to the west. This is 94L. And then that's why we start to get that little southern jog towards Hispaniola. Now, this does not have any merit with the strength, of course. Most of them want to keep it on the weaker side. There's some dry air it's going to contend with over the next few days. And then it kind of forces it down to the south a little bit because of that nice big bubble that David was talking about there.
Correct, absolutely. And that's another thing I want to discuss too, because I'm seeing some of these high vis channels out there on YouTube mentioning that this Invest 94L is a big threat, needs to be watched. Naturally, anything that wanders into the Caribbean is a threat. Don't get me wrong. But we also need to pay our respects and pay our homage to the different systems that we've seen all year. First and foremost, it doesn't have the same capabilities as Beryl, as Helene, as Milton, most recently as Kirk, etc. Some of the heavy hitters on the table for 2024. We have a ton of dry air out there right now. If Jonathan were to pull up the water vapor, which we will show later on into the brief, unless Jonathan, as we're talking, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up now, that's why this thing is such a dud out there in the Atlantic and our models are falling out of love with it. It's wandering through dry air. We're also in a very unfavorable phase of the MJO. We are in a suppressed phase, and as the name implies, we're literally just suppressing the air over the Atlantic. We really don't have much in the terms of instability or rising motions going on. And then on top of that, as Melissa mentioned in the chat with the cooler air coming down, we're going to be running headfirst into a fairly strong polar front jet stream and a temperature gradient. And if you've been following Jonathan and I on these Tropics Watch or any of the discussions we've done, we always emphasize that cyclones that come from the tropics, they hate temperature gradients. So the fact that we're already in a very detrimental environment for it, looking at the water vapor shot right here, it's going to be wandering through that for the next 2 to 4 days, give or take its forward speed. Then it's going to have a small window to try to go tropical storm, maybe low-end hurricane, like some of our ensembles do suggest, before it runs face first into literally a wall of high shear and dry air. You can see it there on the water vapor as well. Look at that thin band of very dense dry air and how the water vapor imagery darkens up. You can see over Miami, over the Bahamas, over Cuba, you have the shades of white, gray, even the greens, and then it rapidly transitions to those browns, the reds, the ambers over Orlando. That's the presence of our first front that's coming through, which is why it was a clear day, fantastic day here in Central Florida, especially with all our lineman workers and those still recovering from Milton. That's what this thing is headed towards. And the reason it's going to ricochet and make a run for the hills, or in this case, the central and northern Atlantic, or just dive bomb and crash into the Caribbean, is because it really won't be able to move into an area that'll allow it to explosively intensify. Could this become a hurricane? 110%. Is it more realistic that this will probably be a tropical storm to a very low-end hurricane? Absolutely. So don't let anyone confuse you out there and try to say that this is going to be another major system. Naturally, 2024, and I'm going to kind of go ASMR for a second, 2024 has thrown us some curves, so there is always that level of doubt. We're confident in the data that we're looking at, but as we all know, Milton threw for a lot of people some curves. Same thing with Francine, same thing with Helene. There have been some curveballs, but in this case, Kirk, absolutely, Kirk, and it's curving for sure. As we wander deeper, that's the thing too as well. We got to remember, I know it's weird that we're seeing such a backloaded hurricane season, and I know Jonathan will back me up with this, but there is still such a thing as climatology. As we get closer and closer to Halloween and then eventually Thanksgiving time, the Atlantic is going to want to shut down. Even if we have a 10 out of 10 MJO, even if we have a 10 out of 10 tropical wave, even if we have a 10 out of 10 instability profile, whatever you want to put on the table, naturally, because Mother Earth is trying to say, well, guys, it's time for Thanksgiving, it's time for Christmas, the tropics are going to want to shut down. So we're going to slowly start stepping away from those unrealistic ceilings of everything's going to be a Category 5 and starting to rein our expectations in of, okay, given the parameters here, we do have hot water, sure, but that's another thing this season has proven to us. The Atlantic has been boiling. and we had nothing for most of August, most of September, and now all of a sudden we're ramping back up.
And as we get deeper into that climatology, you can't fight it for one if you're a storm. We naturally increase the wind shear from the poles into the tropics as we increase the temperature gradient because of the tilt of the earth and the seasons coming through. So that is one thing that naturally hates it. And I think a great example of how the synoptic level kind of bullies these storms and how they're really no match for that is Milton. I mean, it was a strong Cat 5 like crazy. As soon as it felt that little bit of resistance from that trough that ended up kind of lifting it closer to St. Pete, Sarasota, Gulf Coast of Florida, it was already starting to weaken and becoming less consolidated and less hurricaney, if you will. You really can't beat the synoptics of it. Hurricanes are no match.
Exactly. We have a question in the chat. EO, can you explain for us during the height of hurricane season, once a hurricane enters the Gulf, what steers it either towards Texas, Louisiana, or towards Florida? So I'm going to go ahead and itch my eyes. I apologize, folks, if that seems unprofessional. They're hurting tonight. But essentially, that goes back to what I like to call the careful game of tropical chess. If you have a system coming in from either the Florida Straits or, God forbid, like a Rita, Katrina, where it hits Florida, moving west, and then gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it's a very careful game of timing. And if you've tuned in, I'm sure Jonathan has said the same thing before my arrival to News 6. I've said the same thing on my channel as well. A lot of the times when we're making these tropical forecasts, whether it be kind of mimicking what National Hurricane Center is putting out or what we're looking into and digging into from the synoptic scale, which synoptic is the term for just the big picture weather pattern. We're talking North America, Central America, the entirety of the Atlantic. We're, believe it or not, looking at features that are in the Pacific slowly making their way into our viewing area, that being the United States, and timing it with when our tropical system is expected to either be in the Caribbean, be in the Central Atlantic, be in the Gulf of Mexico. So if a system manages to walk its way into the Gulf of Mexico during, we'll say hypothetically, what's called a negative Pacific North American oscillation, a negative PNA, we're going to have ridging over the East United States. As a result, it's going to be pushed west. That was Barrel's situation. We had a strong negative PNA over the East United States. We had a very dominant positive NAO, North Atlantic oscillation, which means a strong Bermuda Azores high. So the only escape route, the path of least resistance, is going to be off to the west. And that's what pushed Barrel all the way from the CVs through the Antilles, through the Caribbean, and all the way up to the Yucatan and into Houston. With the situation like Milton, opposite direction. It's actually great we can draw comparisons like that. Not great that we had the storms, but for the sake of answering your question, Beryl, completely opposite pattern than that of Milton. With Milton, we had a positive PNA, lots of troughing over the eastern United States, and a weakened NAO. We've actually been in a weakened NAO for a while now. And as a result, as Jonathan's drawing, we had a trough that was pretty much ejecting all of our moisture, all of our energy, that low pressure being Milton off towards the east. That's why this thing was ripping off towards the east-northeast, because we had a weakened high pressure in the Atlantic and strong dominant troughing over the east United States, so it only had one direction to go. It's not going to go into the ridge over Texas, Louisiana. It's going to find the area with which it will have the least amount of resistance or pushback with, following the lowest pressure values out there. And so as a result, that's why it came across Florida in the fashion that it did. And I also want to address something as well for EO and everybody else who's watching, because I know a lot of folks were mentioning this during Milton's life cycle, that it was a weird and almost manipulated storm. That's entirely false, because if you guys recall, almost to the T, as a matter of fact, just about within days, Friday the 13th in 2023, Jonathan, I know you were here at News 6, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Friday the 13th in October, we had that overnight tornado outbreak here in Florida. Mm-hmm. That was from a system that was forecast to go tropical from the Bay of Campeche and move into Florida in the exact same fashion. We just had two opposite iterations of it. El Nino kept it as a sheared, almost frontal cyclone, which is what gave us the tornadoes. Sad thing is, with Milton, we had the tropical cyclone and still had the tornadoes. So in this case, we had exactly what happened last year, with the fact that it was a major hurricane that brought it on. So same scenario, same pattern, 2 different storms. So it's not as unrealistic or as rare as some may have alluded to if you just kind of pay attention to the pattern, really. That's the whole thing in a nutshell.
That's the big stuff. And as we get ready to wrap things up, David, I know you want to show some stuff to go a little long range. And I know we have a lot of people probably wondering, okay, is Milton it? We do have those 2 things out there. Are we going to get another name? Are we shutting things down once we get into November? What do you have out there as you kind of switch things over, switch the sources he's going to be working on, showing you some long range stuff because it is interesting. We talked about before the season, really, we highlighted 2 spots. It was Texas and Florida's gotten 3 of them. And hopefully that's it because we can't take any more. All right, so this is the interesting part that David has.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the little segue there. So right now, it makes sense that we have such a lackluster 94L out there. We've been taking a look at some of our global models, like the JMA for one. We've been looking at the European ensembles, long range, the GFS 35-day ensembles, looking at our MJO phasing and looking at when we could potentially become favorable for tropical Atlantic activity. And that's the kicker here as well. I see other sources out there, whether they be official or unofficial, bringing up velocity charts like these, basically showing the motions in the atmosphere from the vertical. You guys can't see me using my hands. There we go. So the blues and the teals are going to be your rising motions, and the reds, the oranges, and the browns are going to be the sinking motions. And if you look right on target where the timestamp starts at the top of this chart, it's a time-phased chart. So the higher you go, the closer you are to real time. You go all the way to the bottom of the chart and notice that we are just after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, 26 November. So it does look like there is going to be one last ditch window for the Atlantic to try to produce between the 21st of October and getting close to the Thanksgiving holiday. Not saying, again, and that's another thing I want to go ahead and explain to you all, these charts do not show tropical cyclone activity. They don't. That's impossible. It's probable, but it's not possible to forecast the activity itself. What we're showing you here is when the basin, the entirety of the Atlantic basin, becomes more favorable for development. I see a lot of folks mentioning when they look at this, there's your tropical storm or there's your hurricane. No, this is only one piece of the puzzle, and 2024 has taught us that pretty well, that obviously it takes a lot more than hot water and no wind shear. There's been a lot of different things out there that we've had to closely inspect and scrutinize that I feel, honestly, even though we may not have gotten the named storm count, we're going to come away as better meteorologists regardless because we took the time to deep dive into what was really boggling and bogging down the season. We had some winds out there. Obviously, we didn't have a rockin' August and September gangbusters 20, 30 named storms up to this point. But of course, it's always a give and take. So we've had the impacts regardless of the named storms. So we got to thank God that we didn't have the amount of named storms to then potentially equate to the impacts. But that's neither here nor there. It looks like between the 21st of October to about, we'll say, the 16th at the very latest of November is when those rising motions will then become affixed to the Atlantic again. And again, for those of you, I'm not looking at the chat right now because this is when the speculation comes into it, and we're not speculating anything. What we're saying is if the Atlantic were to try to develop more named storms, that would probably be our best phase to do so. We're not saying there's going to be more. We had plenty of these forecast models say, yeah, we're going to have rising motions, gangbusters, 50 named storms all at once, hyperactivity, and then nothing happened. So all we're saying is between now and then, remember, climatology is a thing too. The Atlantic is naturally going to start to dry out. The intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ, is going to start to recede back to the south. We're no longer in summer, so we're already starting to see that ITCZ, that convergence area where our waves will follow the jet off of Africa, sinking back to the south. So we're going to start to close up shop more or less. Cabo Verde season should already be done. We might get 1 or 2 more robust tropical waves, but I think our attention is really going to turn to the Caribbean. If a meandering wave out there gets into the Caribbean, it's a possibility. If we have one of these strong fronts come down, we already see the strong fronts coming in. We're going to be switching back to a June-July setup. Minus Beryl. Beryl was an anomaly. It was like the rogue Agent Smith in the Matrix. So we're going to be watching closer. We're going to be looking at our long-range ensembles. I did want to show one other thing that does kind of back up this statement as well. And Jonathan, I didn't get a chance to show you this earlier because you were going in for the 6 o'clock show, but if I pull up the Oh gosh, don't tell me we lost it. Looks like we're getting, oh, it looks like the new data is coming in. So I was looking at the 10th. So this here is going to be our long range 45-day ensemble. And before anyone in the chat comes in and says, why are you looking 45 days out? Hype. No, what I'm using this for as an ensemble is just to kind of give us a clue as to where we should be watching for our global models like the GFS, the Euro, etc., to maybe start to try to put together ingredients that could then manifest into a tropical cyclone. There's levels to this, and Jonathan and I can't wait until the tropics completely close up so we can start to do more educational segments on how a forecast is built. We're not going off the model run. We're not going off of spaghetti plots. What I'm showing you all here is where him and I are going to be watching over the next few weeks for the potential for the ingredients to develop something. Because without the ingredients, you're never going to develop anything. So what's the point of looking at a storm? Anyways,
and real quick, David, if I can just jump in real quick, you mentioned about going to model run.
yeah,
A lot of people latched on at the 11th hour for that southward shift in the spaghetti models, whereas all of the global models and the hurricane models that we had still showed Sarasota just south of Tampa as landfall when we're talking about Milton. Most channels latched onto that and said, okay, this is coming to Naples. This is coming to Fort Myers again. I'm not going to tell you that we didn't stress out, because if you would have seen me pulling my hair out at about, what, 10 o'clock the night before landfall, we were like, what is going on? I mean, it was a very stressful time. But we got back to work. And again, it's not patting on the back per se. It's just there's a difference between, okay, hey, the GFS is showing this today. Okay, is that going to be plausible or is that going to be wrong? That's where the meteorology comes in to look at the other things and be like, okay,
exactly.
the GFS is out to lunch today. There's no way the Icon is going to do that. There's no way the HWARF is going to make this thing a Cat 5. That's where we need to pay attention to, because a lot of channels are just going to be like, okay, hey, watch. And it doesn't happen. So be careful with that. And I think Milton was a big win for meteorologists and a loss for the hypers that are out there for sure, because there was a lot of garbage out there on the 11th hour.
I completely agree. 3,000% if I could. All of us were, Jonathan, myself, Chief Meteorologist Candace Campos, Julie Broughton, everybody at the Pinpoint Weather Team. We were sitting there kind of like, there's a big discontinuity between this guidance. And that's why now you'll see some of our social media posts are kind of modestly airing out the fact that we held together. We came to a group consensus. That is why we have models, but that's also why we have trained weather experts such as ourselves, because the models are never, ever gospel. And if you don't know how to use the models to create your forecast, you're going to be wrong almost all the time, just about every single time. There's a difference between finding a good model run and clinging to it and looking like you hit a home run versus just simply getting lucky, beginner's luck, like Mr. Miyagi would say in Karate Kid. So anyways, before we wrap up the stream, I'm just going to show you the long-range ensembles here. And you can see that, honestly, the Euro is a dead stick. This is already the 24th of October we're looking at here. Not a whole lot, minus, maybe a couple of blips out there. Really not even showing any love to 94L. If you go just beyond that to the end, close to Halloween time, which, it's kind of an iconic date for me, being such a spooky fan of mine, or being such a spooky fan. If you look at the spaghetti plots, that's when the Caribbean really does start to light up as we go towards Halloween and then shortly into November, which mimics really well what the anomaly chart is showing. Let me switch over to active storms so you can see a play-by-play right there. We get a very good clustering between October 26th, I would say, to the first week of November. Now, see, that's the kicker. That's where we as meteorologists come in to decipher the data. It's not saying that there's a storm specifically going to form on the 26th, hang out in the Caribbean until November 7th. No, what that's telling us is we have some ensemble members agreeing that if there was going to be a spot that something could form, it's there between these dates and times. So now as we get closer in time, we're going to continue to investigate the data in the short range and decipher whether or not this is an accurate signal, a generalized spot we need to be watching, or if this missed the mark. So there's still more to come. We're not done with hurricane season yet. Don't really anticipate it's going to be anything wild out there. We're probably not going to get any more successive systems unless, Mother Nature pulls a Hail Mary. We'll have to see. But where we stand right now, definitely looking at maybe 2, 3, 4 more named storms, and that's really being generous for the Atlantic Basin. I would err more so on the side of 2 to 3 more storms. We may get through Nadine, Oscar, and then what was the next one? Jonathan, you had the named list pulled up earlier.
Ooh. I know S is Sarah.
Sarah slams. Wasn't it? Let me go back to, let me switch us back over to links
right?
4, and then we can pull up the named storm list just as a bit of like a prognosis for the viewers, and then we can close up.
All right. Hey, if you guys know what the P storm is, post it in the comments. I can't.
Oh, it is Patty. Okay, I was thinking Patty. Someone threw it in the comments there, Patty. So yeah,
Wow,
Peppermint Patty from Charlie Brown.
That seems kind of wild. We had a Patricia in the Pacific and a Patty in the. They kind of got lazy there.
Kind of, yeah, kind of.
Come on, WMO.
But that's that, folks. So, I mean, 94L, there's going to be, some tension out there in the Caribbean. I'm going to be watching it closely alongside Jonathan and the rest of the News 6 team, just because it is headed in our general direction. Do we think it's something for Florida to worry about? No, it's just not. It's not going to be possible. We're going to have such strong frontal systems coming down and a very dominant high pressure that it's not going to allow anything through. So don't fall for the classic, Nadine's coming or seeing the giant blobs over Florida or something like that. This is not a Florida storm, and we can confidently say that. We would need something to go very, very wrong in the atmosphere. And when I say that, dang near impossible. You can see here in the steering pattern overlay that Jonathan has pulled up, it's either going to go south of us, kind of cut the difference, and possibly try to become something over the Caribbean, affecting Hispaniola, the Turks and Caicos, might try to come very close to Puerto Rico and then Jamaica before a crash landing into Central America, or it'll be ripped off towards the north and rock on up towards Bermuda before exiting our AOR alongside the development of another frontal system right along that boundary. So some pretty interesting developments, but nothing here in Central Florida that we need to be worried about. We'll keep you guys very closely updated for the Caribbean, the Lesser and Greater Antilles, and monitor for all of our lovely viewers down there. But in terms of Florida, if you hear any more of those rumors out there that we're going to get hit by a hurricane, first of all, it should be here in 2 days per social media. So that's definitely, unless we have something spawn in like a video game NPC, that's not happening. And this system's not going to have an opportunity to move far enough to the west. So I mean, if you're one of those folks out there for some strange reason who's waiting for the next one, you're going to have to keep waiting. We're thanking the Lord that we're getting a nice break after how tiring Milton and Helene was over the last 2 weeks. So that's that.
Absolutely. All right, David, thank you for your expertise. It's always fun collaborating with you, especially when we can kind of take a bite out of the misinformation and the hype and just talk about meteorology without too many people being affected. Again, we're going to watch this for our friends in the Caribbean. Don't let some other Caribbean focused channels scare you either. By the way, I'm not going to name names. If you know who I'm talking about, post that in the comments. But we'll leave it at that. And again, thank you to everybody who joined in. If you found this live stream informative, helpful, maybe borderline entertaining with the chat room with Joe the Troll Hunter, we're going to call him because he was throwing facts tonight against some misinformation. So thank you, Joe. Thank you to everybody who was after that fawn person or whatever. She got a 30-minute timeout. By the time she gets back out of timeout, we're going to be off the live stream. Thank you guys as well for being here. I hope everybody's staying safe after the hurricanes. And again, hit that subscribe button for us if you're watching on the YouTube channel. If you're watching on News 6 Plus, thank you. Again, we've also been live on clickorlando.com. We will catch you soon. Be safe out there. Avoid the hype. Avoid the misinformation. Avoid the trolls. We'll catch you next time, guys. See ya.
Have a good night, everybody.